They built the machinery of mass murder. They stood watch over barbed wire and electric fences. They administered beatings, selections and executions, not as soldiers in the heat of battle, but as bureaucrats of death, carrying out murder with the cold efficiency of a factory shift. The concentration camp guards of Nazi Germany were among the most prolific perpetrators of atrocities in human history. And when the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the question was simple and urgent. Where did they go? What happened to the men and women who had turned genocide into a daily routine? Did justice find them all, or did some simply walk away, blend back into ordinary German life and live out their days in peace, while their victims lay in mass graves across Europe? In the chaos of May 1945, with Germany in ruins and Allied armies sweeping across the continent from both directions, tens of thousands of concentration camp personnel faced a reckoning unlike anything history had seen. Before, some were captured immediately, still wearing their uniforms at the camps they had run. Others shed their SS insignia, forged new identities and tried to disappear into the tide of displaced refugees flooding across a shattered continent. Some fled overseas, vanishing into South America, the Middle East and beyond, aided by escape networks that stretched from Vatican corridors to Argentine immigration offices. And others, remarkably, simply went home. They moved back to their villages, found jobs, raised families, and for years, even decades, faced no consequences whatsoever for what they had done. The story of what happened to the camp guards after World War II is a story of justice delayed, justice denied, and justice pursued across half a century. It is a story of dramatic captures and harrowing trials, of daring escapes and quiet impunity, of perpetrators who confessed and perpetrators who never stopped lying. It is also a story about what it means to hold individuals responsible for crimes committed within a system designed to make mass murder feel ordinary. In this video, we will find out what became of them. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Rudolf Höss is perhaps the most chilling figure in the entire history of the concentration camp system, not because he was exceptionally brutal by the standards of the SS, but because he was exceptionally efficient. Born on November 25, 1900, in Baden-Baden, Germany, Höss grew up in a devoutly Catholic household, raised by a father who intended him for the priesthood. His path took a very different direction. He served in World War I as a teenager, becoming one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army, and by the early 1920s, he had thrown himself into the world of right-wing paramilitaries and nationalist politics. In 1922, he joined the Nazi Party, and 2 years later, he served a prison sentence for his involvement in a political murder, a killing carried out in the name of nationalist revenge. It was in prison that he encountered Heinrich Himmler's SS network, and after his release, his fate was sealed. Höss joined the SS in 1934 and was assigned to the concentration camp system almost immediately. He served under the feared Theodor Eicke at Dachau, learning the administrative and disciplinary frameworks that would shape the entire camp network. By 1938, he was at Sachsenhausen, rising steadily through the ranks. Then, in May 1940, he received the assignment that would write his name permanently into the darkest pages of history. He was appointed the first commandant of Auschwitz, a new camp being established in occupied Poland, on the site of a former Polish army barracks near the town of Oswiecim. What Höss built there over the next 5 years would become the largest and most lethal killing facility in human history. Under Höss's command, Auschwitz expanded from a relatively modest detention camp into a vast complex of subcamps, factories, and extermination facilities. He oversaw the construction of Auschwitz II-Birkenau, with its infamous ramp where SS doctors conducted selections, separating those deemed capable of forced labor from those sent immediately to the gas chambers. It was Höss who, after consultation with senior SS leaders including Himmler himself, approved the use of Zyklon B as the primary killing agent at Auschwitz, replacing earlier methods that had been considered too inefficient and too psychologically damaging for the perpetrators. He later described this decision with a bureaucratic detachment that makes the blood run cold, noting that the advantage of the new method was that the killing could be done with fewer personnel. By the time Höss left Auschwitz as commandant in late 1943, over 1 million people had already been murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews from across German-occupied Europe. What happened to Höss after the war? He was more cunning than many of his colleagues in his attempts to evade capture. When Germany surrendered, he adopted a false identity, posing as a sailor named Franz Lang, and went to work as a farmhand on a rural property in Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. For several months, he successfully hid in plain sight while Allied investigators began building their case against the camp system and its administrators. His wife and children were nearby, but he avoided contact with them to reduce the risk of being traced. However, British intelligence agents were closing in. In March 1946, they arrested his wife Hedwig and interrogated her aggressively, eventually threatening to send their young son to the Soviet zone unless she cooperated. Hedwig broke. She revealed her husband's location. On March 11, 1946, British soldiers raided the farm, arrested the man known as Franz Lang, and quickly confirmed his true identity. Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, was in custody. He was transferred to Nuremberg, where he gave testimony at the International Military Tribunal. Remarkably, in his testimony he confirmed and even corrected the prosecutor's estimates of Auschwitz's death toll, insisting that the actual number killed was higher than the 2.5 million the prosecution had alleged, though later historical research would establish more precise figures in the range of 1.1 to 1.5 million. His testimony was given in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone that characterized everything about his approach to mass murder. He was then extradited to Poland, where the Supreme National Tribunal put him on trial in Warsaw in March 1947. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. In a final act of grim symbolism, on April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged on a specially constructed gallows erected immediately beside the crematorium of Auschwitz I, at the very camp he had built and commanded. He was 46 years old. Before his execution, Höss wrote an autobiography. In his prison cell, a document that remains one of the most disturbing primary sources in Holocaust historiography, less for its admissions of guilt than for the almost administrative tone in which he describes organizing the murder of more than 1 million human beings. He claimed, improbably, that he had simply been following orders and that the weight of command had been a burden he bore alone. The gallows at Auschwitz told a different story. Theodor Eicke never faced the justice that awaited Höss, and in a grim irony, it was the Eastern Front that claimed him rather than any Allied tribunal. Born on October 17, 1892 in Hampont, Alsace-Lorraine, Eicke had served in World War I and spent much of the interwar period in a mixture of police work and violent right-wing politics. He joined the SS in 1930 and rapidly established himself as one of Himmler's most brutal and effective lieutenants. His defining contribution to Nazi Germany was the creation of the concentration camp system as a functioning institution. In 1933, after the establishment of Dachau as the first official Nazi concentration camp, Eicke was appointed its commandant, and he set about designing what he called the model camp system. He introduced the specific regulations governing guard behavior, prisoner treatment, and punishment that would be replicated across every subsequent camp in the Nazi network. He trained the SS Totenkopfverbände, the death's head units that staffed the camps, instilling in them a culture of extreme brutality combined with bureaucratic discipline. In Eicke's design, violence was not chaos. It was procedure. Beyond his role in building the camp system, Eicke achieved personal infamy on June 30, 1934, the night of the Long Knives, when he personally shot Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, on Hitler's orders. The willingness to execute a senior party figure on command demonstrated the kind of loyalty that bought careers in the Third Reich. By 1939, Eicke was commanding the SS Totenkopf division in military operations, taking his death camp ethos into battlefield combat. He commanded the division through the fall of France and into the catastrophic opening phase of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. His division was involved in the massacre of prisoners of war and atrocities against Soviet civilians. By the winter of 1941, Eicke had established himself as one of the more brutal field commanders on the Eastern Front, but on February 26, 1943, his luck ran out. His Fieseler Storch reconnaissance aircraft was shot down by Soviet ground fire near Orelka in Ukraine. He was killed instantly. The man who had built the death camp system died in the field, and no trial would ever hold him accountable for the thousands of lives destroyed in the institution he designed. Oswald Pohl was not a camp commandant. He was something arguably more dangerous, a technocrat. As the chief of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, the SS Economic Administrative Main Office, known as the WW2, Pohl ran the entire economic infrastructure of the concentration camp system. Born on June 30, 1892 in Duisburg, he had served as a naval officer in World War I before joining the Nazi Party and the SS in the early 1920s. His skills were administrative and financial, and Himmler recognized them. By 1942, Pohl's WVHA oversaw every aspect of the camp network's economic function, including the exploitation of prisoner labor for German industry, the confiscation and processing of the personal property of murdered victims, and the operation of SS-owned enterprises. When the SS stripped gold teeth from the bodies of the murdered and sent the metal to the Reichsbank, it was Pohl's organization that managed the logistics. When German corporations like IG Farben and Volkswagen leased camp prisoners as forced laborers, it was Pohl's office that negotiated the contracts. He transformed mass murder into an industrial enterprise. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Pohl attempted to flee. He assumed a false identity and initially found refuge with a farmer in Lower Saxony. He managed to evade capture until May 1946, when he was arrested by American forces. At the Nuremberg Pohl trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by American military tribunals, he was tried alongside 17 other senior WVHA officials. Prosecutors laid out in meticulous detail how Pohl's office had organized and profited from the systematic murder of millions. He was convicted and sentenced to death. After several years of delays, appeals, and interventions by Catholic Church officials who had baptized Pohl into Catholicism while he awaited execution, the sentence was finally carried out on June 7, 1951. Oswald Pohl was hanged at Landsberg prison in Bavaria, the same facility where Hitler had once written Mein Kampf. He was 58 years old. Josef Kramer earned one of the most terrifying epithets applied to any concentration camp official during the entire war, a title that newspapers around the world deployed the moment British soldiers opened the gates of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, and the horrifying conditions inside became known to a stunned public. They called him the Beast of Belsen. Born on November 10, 1906, in Munich, Kramer joined the SS in 1931 and entered the concentration camp system in 1934, serving at Dachau before postings to Sachsenhausen and then Mauthausen. He served under Höss at Auschwitz in 1941 before becoming the commandant of the Natzweiler Struthof camp in Alsace in 1942. It was at Natzweiler Struthof that Kramer personally participated in the gassing of 80 Jewish prisoners whose bodies were sent to the Reich University of Strasbourg for the construction of a skeleton collection. When the Allies liberated the camp in late 1944, they found the killing chamber Kramer had operated and eventually linked the gassings directly to his command. By the late summer of 1944, Kramer had been transferred back to Auschwitz-Birkenau as its final commandant during the period of the most intensive deportations, when Hungarian Jews were arriving at the ramp in such numbers that the crematoria could not cope with the bodies. In December 1944, Kramer was sent to command Bergen-Belsen, a camp that had been conceived not as an extermination centre, but as a detention facility. Under the pressure of the final months of the war, however, Bergen-Belsen became something close to a death camp through neglect rather than design, as tens of thousands of prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the Eastern Front were crammed into facilities far beyond their capacity. Food deliveries collapsed. Typhus spread. The water supply failed. When British soldiers of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found approximately 60,000 surviving prisoners in conditions of almost incomprehensible horror, alongside roughly 13,000 unburied corpses. Kramer was still there in uniform on the grounds of the camp. He was arrested immediately. The Belsen trial, held in Lüneburg in the British occupation zone from September to November 1945, was one of the first major war crimes proceedings after the end of the war in Europe. Kramer faced charges related to atrocities at both Natzweiler Struthof and Bergen-Belsen. The prosecution presented survivor testimony and documentary evidence in painstaking detail. Kramer offered no meaningful defense for what had occurred at Belsen, instead claiming that he had repeatedly requested more food and supplies from higher authorities and been refused. The court was unmoved. On November 17, 1945, Josef Kramer was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison in Germany. He was 39 years old. Among the most sensational figures in the Belsen trial was a young woman named Irma Grisse, whose case attracted enormous press attention across Europe and North America in the autumn of 1945. Born on October 7, 1923, in Recken in the Mecklenburg region of Germany, Grisse came from a rural, working-class background. Her early years were unremarkable by the standards of the time. She left school at 14, tried working as a farm labourer and a shop assistant, and in 1942, at the age of 18, she applied to serve as an SS Aufseherin, a female camp guard. She was assigned to Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, for training, and in 1943 she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. By 1944 she had risen to the position of Oberaufseherin, or senior supervisor, in the women's camp at Birkenau. Survivor testimony about Grisse was extensive and consistent in its horror. She was described as carrying a plaited whip with which she beat prisoners, occasionally to death. She was alleged to have personally selected prisoners for the gas chambers on multiple occasions, pointing out individuals she found weak or troublesome for inclusion in the daily death selections. She was said to have kept dogs which she set on prisoners. Survivors described her as deriving visible pleasure from cruelty, and several witnesses spoke of her vanity, her love of fine clothes and the incongruity of her appearance, blonde and conventionally attractive, against the backdrop of the killing fields of Birkenau. She was transferred to Bergen-Belsen before the liberation, where British soldiers arrested her. At the Belsen trial, she was convicted of war crimes at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. On November 17, 1945, she was sentenced to death. She was hanged on December 13, 1945, the same day as Josef Kramer, at Hamelin Prison. She was 22 years old, the youngest woman executed by the British for crimes committed during World War II. Another woman whose name became synonymous with the horror of the camp system was Elisabeth Volkenrath, who served as the chief female supervisor at Bergen-Belsen at the time of its liberation. Born on September 5, 1919, in Schönau an der Katzbach in Lower Silesia, Volkenrath had joined the SS as an Aufseherin in 1941 and worked her way up through various camps before reaching Bergen-Belsen. Survivors testified that she had conducted selections at Auschwitz, personally choosing women for the gas chambers, and had administered brutal beatings throughout her service. Like Grisse and Kramer, she was tried at the Belsen trial and convicted of war crimes. She was hanged on December 13, 1945, also at Hamelin Prison. The mass execution of December 13, 1945, which claimed the lives of Kramer, Grisse, Volkenrath, and 7 other convicted Bergen-Belsen personnel, represented one of the largest single executions carried out by British forces in the post-war period. The trial and execution of Fritz Klein demonstrated that the medical professionals who served in the camp system would not escape justice either, at least not when they were caught. Born on November 27, 1888, in Zeiden, Transylvania, Klein had practiced medicine in Romania before the war and brought himself to the attention of the SS through his enthusiastic embrace of Nazi racial ideology. He served as an SS doctor at several camps, but it was his time at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he participated in the selection process on the infamous arrival ramp that defined his criminal history. Survivors described Klein standing on the Birkenau ramp, motioning prisoners left or right as the trains disgorged their human cargo, sending the majority, the old, the very young, the sick and the weak, directly to the gas chambers. In a widely reproduced photograph taken shortly after liberation, Klein is shown standing in a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen, surrounded by the bodies of those who had died under his supervision. He was tried alongside Kramer and the others at the Belsen trial, convicted of war crimes, and hanged on December 13, 1945. Amon Göth cast a shadow across occupied Poland that was so deep, so personal, and so grotesque that decades after the war, his name would become familiar to millions through Steven Spielberg's 1993 film Schindler's List, in which Ralph Fiennes portrayed him with a portrayal so chilling that it won the actor an Academy Award nomination. Born on December 11, 1908 in Vienna, Austria, Göth was the son of a publisher and grew up in a middle-class Catholic household, joining the Austrian Nazi Party in 1930, well before Austrian Nazism became mainstream. By 1940, he had entered the SS and was working within the administration of the General Government, the German-occupied territory of central Poland. In 1942, he was tasked with a specific and horrifying assignment, the liquidation of the Jewish ghettos of the Krakow district, and from February 1943, the command of the Krakow-Płaszów concentration camp. What made Göth exceptional even by the already debased standards of the SS was the degree to which he practiced personal, intimate cruelty. He was known to shoot prisoners from the balcony of his villa overlooking the camp, sometimes using a rifle, sometimes a pistol, occasionally simply for target practice. Survivor testimony consistently described him executing prisoners for reasons that amounted to nothing: a missed salute, a moment of eye contact, a whispered conversation. His two Great Danes, Ralph and Rolf, were trained to attack and maul prisoners on command. He maintained a Jewish housekeeper, Helen Hirsch, whose testimony both at post-war trials and later to Spielberg's research team described a life of constant terror in which she expected to die at any moment. The German industrialist Oskar Schindler, who ran a factory using Jewish prisoner labour, knew Göth well and reportedly spent significant sums bribing him to spare specific workers. When German forces retreated from Poland in late 1944, Göth was arrested, not by the Allies but by the SS itself, on charges of theft and the unauthorised killing of prisoners. Beyond what the camp system officially sanctioned, a bitterly ironic reminder that even within the machinery of the Holocaust there were bureaucratic limits. He was held in an SS sanatorium and was still there when the war ended. American forces arrested him in 1945 and extradited him to Poland. He was tried before the Supreme National Tribunal in Krakow on charges including the murder of tens of thousands of people. The testimony against him was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On September 13, 1946, Amon Göth was hanged at Krakow prison. He was 37 years old. Franz Stangl presents one of the most disturbing cases in the entire history of post-war justice, precisely because he almost got away with it entirely, and for years lived a comfortable, untroubled life, while the full weight of what he had done was never brought to bear on him. Born on March 26, 1908 in Altmünster in Upper Austria, Stangl was the son of a night watchman and trained as a weaver before joining the Austrian police force in 1931. He was an unremarkable officer in most respects, efficient, conscientious, careful. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, Stangl joined the Nazi Party and the SS almost immediately. His administrative competence attracted the attention of his superiors, and in 1940 he was transferred to the T4 euthanasia program, through which the Nazi regime systematically murdered disabled Germans in facilities disguised as medical institutions. Stangl served as the police superintendent of a killing centre at Hartheim Castle in Austria, where thousands of victims with mental and physical disabilities were gassed. His competence in running a killing operation brought him to the attention of the architects of Operation Reinhard, the program designed to murder the entire Jewish population of occupied Poland. In 1942, Stangl was appointed commandant of the Sobibor extermination camp in the Lublin district of occupied Poland. Sobibor was a pure killing centre, one of the Operation Reinhard camps designed with a single purpose: to receive Jews transported by rail and murder them immediately in gas chambers using carbon monoxide from diesel engines. There were no selections, no barracks for the living, no labour details. Those who arrived at Sobibor were dead within hours. Stangl's efficiency pleased his superiors, and in late 1942 he was transferred to Treblinka, the largest of the Operation Reinhard camps, which was having organisational problems. Under Stangl's management, Treblinka became a smoothly functioning death factory. He later admitted in an interview conducted by journalist Gita Sereni that by the time he finished his work at Treblinka, the camp had murdered approximately 900,000 people. When the war ended, Stangl was captured and interned in an American POW camp, but in 1947 he somehow escaped from custody. What followed was a story of escape so audacious that it continued to provoke outrage for decades. With the assistance of Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian Catholic bishop based in Rome who helped a number of Nazi fugitives, Stangl made his way through Italy and eventually to Damascus in Syria, where he lived openly for years. In 1951, he emigrated to Brazil, where he lived under his own name and found work at the Volkswagen factory in São Paulo. He worked there for years, an ordinary factory employee, while the families of 900,000 of his victims built new lives in Israel, the United States, and across the diaspora. Simon Wiesenthal, the renowned Nazi hunter, identified Stangl's location in Brazil in the mid-1960s and began pressing for his extradition. Brazilian authorities arrested Stangl in 1967, and he was extradited to West Germany in 1970. At his trial in Düsseldorf, he was convicted of co-responsibility for the murder of 900,000 people and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of heart failure in Düsseldorf prison on June 28, 1971, less than 9 months after sentencing. He never expressed remorse. In his final interviews with Gita Sereni, which she published as the devastating book Into That Darkness, he continued to insist on the separateness of his self from his actions, as if the man who had run Treblinka were a different creature altogether. Kurt Franz was Stangl's deputy at Treblinka and outlived him by more than 2 decades, a fact that itself says something about the uneven distribution of justice in the post-war period. Born on January 17, 1914, in Düsseldorf, Franz had worked as a cook before the war and joined the SS in 1937. Like Stangl, he had served in the T4 euthanasia program before being assigned to Operation Reinhard. At Treblinka, Franz was known by the prisoners by a nickname, Lalka, the Polish word for doll, an allusion to his youthful, almost handsome face. The nickname was bitterly ironic, given the reputation for sadism that accompanied him everywhere in the camp. Survivors described Franz routinely using a whip to beat prisoners and encouraging his dog Barry to attack and mutilate people. Unlike some camp officials who claimed ignorance or distance from the actual killing, Franz had kept a personal photo album from his time at Treblinka, which investigators discovered after the war. The album, which Franz had titled Beautiful Years, contained photographs of the camp in operation, documenting in casual, almost tourism-style snapshots the infrastructure of a facility where approximately 900,000 people were murdered. When the war ended, Franz returned to West Germany and lived a quiet life in Düsseldorf for 15 years. He was not arrested until 1959, and his trial in Düsseldorf did not conclude until 1965, 20 years after the end of the war. He was convicted of participating in the murder of approximately 300,000 people and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, in 1993, at the age of 79, he was released from prison on health grounds. Kurt Franz, the deputy commandant of Treblinka, a man whose personal photo album documented his years at a facility that murdered close to 1 million people, lived until 1998. He died in a care home in Düsseldorf. Would all the men and women of the camp system face even this kind of belated justice? Sadly, the answer is no. For every Höss who swung on the gallows outside Auschwitz, and every Stangl who eventually faced a German court, there were dozens of former guards, supervisors and administrators who lived out their lives in complete impunity. Understanding why requires understanding both the scale of the system and the political landscape of post-war Germany. At its height, the Nazi concentration camp system comprised over 1,000 facilities of various types, from the large extermination camps in Poland to smaller subcamps, labour facilities, and transit points scattered across German-controlled Europe. The number of SS personnel who served in these facilities at any point during the war ran into the tens of thousands. Processing all of them through war crimes trials was an undertaking that the Allies, for a combination of practical, political, and resource-related reasons, never completed. Richard Baer was the last commandant of Auschwitz, serving in that role from May 1944 until the camp was evacuated in January 1945, and his fate represents one of the most galling near misses in the entire history of post-war justice. Born on September 9, 1911, in Floss in Bavaria, Baer had joined the SS in 1933 and worked his way through the concentration camp system over more than a decade. As commandant during the period of the largest deportations from Hungary, when between 400 and 500,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and the majority were gassed within weeks of arrival, Baer oversaw a period of killing on a scale that even Auschwitz had not previously reached. Following the camp's evacuation in Hau, January 1945, and the subsequent death march of surviving prisoners westward, Baer managed to disappear. He assumed a false identity, working as a forest worker in an area near Hamburg. For 15 years after the war, he remained undetected while Allied investigators and German prosecutors were building cases against Auschwitz personnel. Baer was finally arrested in December 1960. prompted partly by the renewed public attention to Auschwitz crimes following the capture of Adolf Eichmann earlier that year. He was taken into custody and a major trial was being assembled in Frankfurt, one that would become the landmark Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. However, Richard Baer never stood before a jury. On June 17, 1963, while in pre-trial detention in Frankfurt, he died of a heart attack. He was 51 years old. The last commandant of the largest death camp in human history died in a pre-trial cell, never forced to face the evidence, never required to answer in a courtroom, never convicted of anything. The case of Adolf Eichmann is perhaps the single most dramatic story in the entire post-war hunt for Nazi criminals, combining a cunning fugitive, a secret intelligence operation, an international incident, and a trial that reverberated around the world. Born on March 19, 1906, in Solingen in the German Rhineland, Eichmann grew up in Linz, Austria, a city he shared in childhood proximity with Adolf Hitler himself. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party in 1932 and the SS in 1933, and through a combination of initiative and bureaucratic talent, he established himself within the SD, Himmler's intelligence service, as the regime's foremost expert on Jewish affairs. By the time the final solution was being organized in the early 1940s, Eichmann was the indispensable logistics coordinator for the entire deportation system. It was Eichmann who attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where senior Nazi officials coordinated the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, and it was Eichmann who was responsible for organizing the transport of Jews from across Europe to the extermination camps in the East. He was not personally operating the gas chambers. He never commanded a camp, but without Eichmann's meticulous organization of train schedules, population counts, and bureaucratic coordination between the SS, the German railways, and the governments of occupied and Allied states, the scale of the Holocaust's industrial murder would have been impossible. When historians later tallied the deportations he had organized, they estimated that Eichmann had personally overseen the transport of approximately 6 million Jews to their deaths. He understood perfectly what was at the end of those railway lines. When Rudolf Kastner, a Hungarian Jewish leader, negotiated with Eichmann in 1944 to try to save Hungarian Jews, Eichmann told him bluntly he knew exactly what was happening at Auschwitz, and the deportations would continue. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Eichmann was taken prisoner by American forces but managed to escape from custody in early 1946 before anyone realized who they had. He spent several years drifting through Germany before making contact with escape networks, specifically Odessa and other rat-line organizations, which helped former SS men flee Europe. With the assistance of a Franciscan monk in Genoa, Italy, and a Red Cross travel document issued in the name of Ricardo Clement, Eichmann boarded a ship to Buenos Aires, Argentina in July 1950. He settled in a suburb of Buenos Aires called San Fernando, found work at a Mercedes-Benz factory, and for a decade lived quietly as Ricardo Clement, an ordinary Argentine factory worker. His wife and children eventually joined him, and to the neighbors in the dusty working-class suburb where they lived, the Clement family seemed entirely unremarkable. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, had been quietly tracking leads on Eichmann's whereabouts since the early 1950s. In 1957, a tip from a former Nazi hunter in Germany named Fritz Baer, the Attorney General of the German state of Hesse, pointed Mossad's investigators toward Argentina. By early 1960, Mossad operatives had confirmed that Ricardo Clement was Adolf Eichmann. On the night of May 11, 1960, a Mossad team operating in Buenos Aires grabbed Eichmann as he stepped off a bus near his home, bundled him into a car, and held him for 9 days while the operation's logistics were finalized. On May 20, 1960, sedated and disguised as an El Al airline crew member, Eichmann was flown out of Argentina to Israel. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced to the world's astonishment 3 days later, Adolf Eichmann is already in Israeli custody. The trial that followed, held in Jerusalem beginning in April 1961, was one of the most significant legal proceedings of the 20th century. For the first time, the Holocaust was presented in its full scope before an international audience, with the testimony of more than 100 survivors providing a human face to the statistics. Eichmann sat in a glass booth in the courtroom, listening through headphones to testimony that documented crimes organized through his office. He maintained throughout, with a consistency that Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, famously described as the banality of evil, that he had simply been following orders, that he was a minor bureaucrat in a vast machine, that the moral responsibility lay elsewhere. The court was unpersuaded. On December 11, 1961, Eichmann was convicted of crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in criminal organizations. He was sentenced to death. On June 1, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison near Tel Aviv, the only person ever executed by the State of Israel under civilian law. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea beyond Israeli territorial waters so that there would be no grave to become a shrine. Josef Mengele remains the most hunted Nazi criminal of the post-war era, a man whose name became synonymous with the evil of the camp system even decades after his death, and whose escape from justice for nearly 35 years stands as one of the great failures of post-war accountability. Born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Bavaria, Mengele came from a prosperous manufacturing family and received an excellent education, earning doctorates in both medicine and anthropology. He was not, by the standards of the SS, an unusual ideologue. What made him exceptional was the combination of scientific credentials, absolute belief in Nazi racial theory, and a personal clinical curiosity that he chose to gratify in the most horrifying possible setting. In May 1943, SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau as the chief SS physician. What Mengele did at Auschwitz defies adequate description. He conducted experiments on prisoners, primarily Jews and Roma, that constituted some of the most sadistic abuses of medical science ever recorded. He was particularly obsessed with twins, subjecting hundreds of pairs of twins to comparative experiments that involved injecting diseases, performing surgery without anesthesia, administering poisons, and in some cases, vivisection. He was reported to have been cheerful and courteous while conducting these procedures, sometimes handing children candy before subjecting them to experiments that would kill or permanently injure them. He had a particular interest in eye colour and injected chemicals into the eyes of prisoners in attempts to change pigmentation. He stood on the Birkenau arrival ramp repeatedly, conducting the selections that sent hundreds of thousands of people to immediate death, and was remembered by survivors as sometimes conducting selections while whistling opera arias. What made Mengele's post-war fate particularly maddening was how close to capture he came on multiple occasions, and how close to complete escape from justice he ultimately achieved. When Auschwitz was evacuated in January 1945, Mengele was transferred to another camp and then captured by American forces at the end of the war. He was held in an American POW camp but was not identified as Mengele because his name was not initially on the most wanted lists, an oversight that remains difficult to explain. He was released and spent several years in Germany before fleeing Europe. In 1949, using a Red Cross humanitarian passport in the name Josef Mengele, he sailed to Argentina. He lived there openly for years, even briefly using his real name when he applied for Argentine citizenship in 1956. By 1959, as West German authorities issued warrants for his arrest and the international hunt for Eichmann was intensifying, Mengele grew nervous and moved to Paraguay, and then, in 1960, to Brazil, where he settled on a farm in the interior of São Paulo state. For the next 2 decades, Mengele moved between addresses in Brazil, gradually becoming more isolated and increasingly fearful, supported financially by his family's business in Günzburg and by occasional help from other Nazi fugitives. West German, Israeli, and American investigators searched for him repeatedly. In 1979, during a visit to a beach near the town of Bertioga in Brazil, Josef Mengele had a stroke while swimming in the ocean and drowned. He was 67 years old. His body was buried under a false name and was not identified until 1985, when Brazilian authorities exhumed remains from a grave in Embu das Artes, and forensic analysis confirmed the identification. DNA testing in 1992 confirmed conclusively that the bones were Mengele's. The angel of death had drowned in an anonymous Brazilian beach town, never tried, never convicted, never forced to account for the murder of hundreds and the torture of thousands. For the families of his victims, particularly the twins who had survived and spent decades demanding justice, it was an outcome that felt like the cruelest kind of non-ending. Karl Otto Koch was commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp from 1937 to 1941, and his story contains a particularly bitter irony. He was executed not by Allied forces for his crimes against prisoners, but by the SS itself, for corruption and the unauthorized killing of witnesses who could testify against him. Born on August 2, 1897, in Darmstadt, Koch had served in World War I and spent the interwar period in various jobs before joining the Nazi Party and SS in the late 1920s. Under his command, Buchenwald became notorious for the brutality of its conditions and the creative sadism of its administration. Koch and his wife Ilse presided over a culture of casual violence and elaborate cruelty that attracted attention even within the SS, where a certain level of violence was assumed and approved. Koch was arrested by the SS in 1941 on charges of embezzlement and corruption, as well as the murder of 2 prisoners who were also SS doctors and had treated Koch himself, creating the suspicion that he had them killed to prevent them from reporting compromising medical information. After years of investigation by SS Judge Georg Conrad Morgan, who was himself a curious figure given his apparently genuine attempts to enforce a kind of internal SS legal order, even while the camps operated as death factories, Koch was tried before an SS court and convicted. On April 5, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, Karl Otto Koch was executed by the SS at Buchenwald. Ilse Koch, Karl's wife, became perhaps the most notorious female perpetrator associated with the camp system, earning the title the Witch of Buchenwald, and becoming the subject of allegations so extraordinary that they generated both international outrage and, later, significant historical debate. Born on September 22, 1906, in Dresden, Ilse Koch met Karl in 1936 and married him in 1937. The same year, he became Buchenwald's commandant. As the wife of the commandant, she had access to the camp's prisoner population and was accused of extraordinary cruelty, beating prisoners with a riding whip, ordering the killing of prisoners who attracted her attention, and most infamously, collecting lampshades, book covers, and other objects made from tattooed human skin taken from murdered prisoners. The allegations about lampshades made from human skin became one of the most widely reported details of the entire Nuremberg era and were included in American prosecution materials at the Dachau trials in 1947. However, subsequent historical investigation raised questions about the precise physical evidence for the lampshades specifically, though the broader pattern of sadism and the reality of prisoner skin being harvested at Buchenwald have been confirmed by documentary evidence. Ilse Koch was tried at the American Dachau military tribunals in 1947 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Controversially, American military governor Lucius D. Clay reduced her sentence to 4 years in 1948, citing insufficient evidence for some of the most extreme allegations. Her release caused international outrage. The West German government subsequently tried her on new charges, and in January 1951 she was convicted again by a West German court and sentenced to life imprisonment for incitement to murder, assault, and the murder of German citizens at Buchenwald. She remained in prison, refusing any appeal or parole application, and on September 1, 1967, Ilse Koch hanged herself in her cell at Eichach Women's Prison in Bavaria. She was 60 years old. The story of the Dachau camp system's commandants offers a representative cross-section of the various fates that awaited camp officials in the post-war years. Dachau, established on March 22, 1933, was the first official Nazi concentration camp and served as the template for the entire system that followed. Its first commandant, Hilmar Weckele, ran it for only a short time before being replaced by Theodor Eicke in June 1933, whose redesign of Dachau set the standards for the entire network. Martin Gottfried Weiss served as commandant from 1942 to 1943 and again from late 1943 until 1945. He was arrested by American forces when they liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, and was tried at the Dachau trials, one of the series of military tribunals conducted by the American Army for crimes committed at former concentration camps. Weiss was convicted in November 1945 and hanged on May 29, 1946, at Landsberg Prison in Bavaria. Edward Weiter, who was the Dachau commandant in the final months of the war, died under less dramatic circumstances. When American forces approached in late April 1945, Weiter organized the death march of Dachau prisoners southward toward Austria, a march on which thousands died of exhaustion, starvation, and shooting. Weiter himself reached the area around Castle Itter in Austria, where he died on May 2nd, 1945, reportedly by suicide, though the exact circumstances remain somewhat unclear. The Mauthausen concentration camp, located near the town of Mauthausen in Austria on the Danube River, was one of the most brutal facilities in the entire Nazi system. Classified as a Grade 3 camp, the harshest possible category, reserved for prisoners considered incorrigible or beyond rehabilitation in Nazi terminology. Its commandant for most of the war was Franz Stangl, born on August 13, 1905, in Munich. Stangl joined the SS in 1936 and became commandant of Mauthausen in 1939, holding the position until the camp's liberation. Under his command, Mauthausen became notorious for its quarry, where prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks up a steep staircase known as the Stairs of Death, under conditions designed to cause fatal exhaustion. If a prisoner fell or was pushed from the top, guards could claim he had fallen accidentally. Thousands died in the quarry. When American forces arrived at Mauthausen on May 5, 1945, Stangl had already fled. He was tracked down by American soldiers on May 23, 1945, and was shot and wounded while attempting further escape. He was captured, but died of his wounds 3 days later on May 24, 1945, without ever facing a formal trial. But before he died, American intelligence officers conducted a bedside interrogation of the mortally wounded Stangl, during which he gave a lengthy statement implicating numerous other SS officers and providing details of Mauthausen's operations. That deathbed testimony became a significant piece of evidence at subsequent trials of other Mauthausen personnel. The Mauthausen trial, conducted by the American military in 1946, was one of the largest single war crimes proceedings of the entire post-war period. 61 SS personnel associated with the camp were tried simultaneously. 58 were convicted, and 49 of those were sentenced to death. 36 were subsequently hanged, making the Mauthausen proceedings one of the largest mass executions carried out by American forces in the post-war era. Among those convicted was Georg Bachmeier, Mauthausen's adjutant and one of its most feared guards, who was executed on May 28, 1947. The sheer scale of the Mauthausen proceedings reflected the exceptional brutality of that particular camp and the overwhelming evidence assembled by American prosecutors. The case of Jürgen Stroop illustrates how the network of guilt extended beyond the concentration camps themselves to encompass the broader apparatus of German occupation and racial terror. Stroop was born on September 26, 1895, in Detmold in Westphalia, and built a career in the SS that culminated in one of the most notorious actions of the entire war. In April and May 1943, Stroop commanded the German forces that suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the desperate revolt by the remaining Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto against their imminent deportation to the Treblinka extermination camp. The uprising lasted longer than expected, from April 19th to May 16th, 1943, as poorly armed fighters held off the SS and regular police units. When Stroop finally crushed the resistance, he did so by burning the ghetto systematically, building by building, flushing out or killing anyone who remained. When it was over, roughly 13,000 Jews had been killed during the suppression of the uprising, and the remaining 56,000 survivors were deported to Treblinka or to the Lublin labor camps. Stroop was so proud of his achievement that he personally compiled a detailed illustrated report of the entire operation, bound in leather with photographs and statistical summaries, which he titled "Es gibt keinen jüdischen Wohnbezirk in Warschau mehr," meaning "There is no more Jewish residential district in Warsaw." 3 copies were bound. One ended up as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, making it one of the most damning single documents produced by the Nazi system. After the war, Stroop was captured and tried in the American zone of Germany, convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. He was subsequently extradited to Poland, where he was tried again, convicted again, and hanged in Warsaw on March 6, 1952. The Ravensbrück women's concentration camp, located 50 miles north of Berlin, was the largest camp in the Nazi system designed specifically for female prisoners, and the women who served as guards there and at its subcamps included some of the most prolific female perpetrators of the entire war. Ravensbrück was operated throughout the war primarily by female SS Aufseherinnen, under the supervision of male SS commanders, and the women who served there committed atrocities on a scale that shattered any assumption that gender provided any buffer against the capacity for mass cruelty. Dorothea Binz became one of the most feared guards at Ravensbrück, known to prisoners by various terrified nicknames. Born on March 16, 1920 in Dusterhoft in Pomerania, Binz joined the SS in 1939 at the age of 19 and was assigned to Ravensbrück for training. She rose through the ranks to become one of the senior Aufseherinnen at the camp, and survivor testimony consistently described her as conducting savage beatings, whipping prisoners, and personally ordering punishments that resulted in death. She was alleged to have been romantically involved with a male SS officer at the camp, a relationship that observers said seemed to stimulate her cruelty, as if the violence were a form of performance. After the war, Binz was tried by a British military court at the Ravensbrück trial in Hamburg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death. She was hanged on May 2, 1947, at Hamelin Prison, one of 6 former Ravensbrück staff executed as a result of that trial. Another significant figure from Ravensbrück was Johanna Langefeld, who had served as the chief female overseer of the entire Ravensbrück camp from its establishment in 1939 until 1943, when she was removed from her position and transferred after a series of conflicts with male SS commanders who resented her authority. She later served at Auschwitz. After the war, Langefeld was arrested in the American zone and was awaiting transfer for trial when, in 1946, she escaped from American custody. She was never recaptured and lived until 1974, dying in Augsburg, West Germany, having never been brought to trial for her role in administering a camp where over 100,000 women were imprisoned and an estimated 10,000 to 90,000 died. How could someone like Langefeld escape and live out her life in freedom in West Germany? The question points to a fundamental reality of the post-war period. The denazification process was overwhelmed by scale from the very beginning. The Allied powers, particularly the Americans who occupied the largest zone, faced the task of assessing the culpability of millions of German citizens who had participated in the Nazi system in various capacities. The formal denazification tribunals, known as Sprüchkammern, were tasked with categorizing individuals into 5 groups, ranging from major offenders to exonerated, but in practice the process quickly became bureaucratically chaotic. Witnesses were hard to find. Records had been destroyed. Defendants were adept at producing character references, dismissively nicknamed Persilscheiner or whitewash certificates in German public discourse, from colleagues, neighbours, and clergy who attested to their good character. Many former camp guards who appeared before denazification tribunals were classified as followers or minor offenders and released with minimal consequences. The Cold War made everything worse, as the geopolitical confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union deepened through the late 1940s and early 1950s. Western Allied interest in pursuing Nazi war criminals waned dramatically. West Germany was needed as a partner in the Western Alliance, and pressuring the new German government over war crimes was seen in some circles as counterproductive. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government contained a number of former Nazi officials, a fact that was widely known but rarely publicly addressed. Hans Globke, who had written the legal commentary on the Nuremberg racial laws, served as Adenauer's chief of staff until 1963. Theodor Oberländer, who had commanded a unit accused of massacres in Lviv in 1941, served as a cabinet minister. The institutional pressure to put the Nazi period behind and focus on Cold War priorities was enormous, and it created an environment in which many former camp personnel who had not been caught in the immediate post-war roundups could expect to live unmolested. Hans Aumeier, who had served as a senior SS guard and later deputy commandant at various camps, including Auschwitz, offers a specific illustration of how geography and luck shaped post-war outcomes. Aumeier had fled to Norway after the war, where he was caught by Norwegian authorities in 1945. He was tried in Poland, convicted of crimes including the participation in mass murder at Auschwitz, and hanged in Krakow on January 22, 1948. He was one of the last major Auschwitz figures to be executed in the immediate post-war proceedings, and his conviction and execution owed much to the more rigorous approach to war crimes prosecution taken by the Polish courts compared to some Western tribunals. The contrast with figures who escaped to sympathetic neutral or South American countries is stark. Richard Glucks had served throughout the war as the inspector of concentration camps under Oswald Pohl's WW2, a position of enormous administrative authority over the entire camp system. He was the man who had received the regular reports of prisoner numbers, mortality rates, and camp operations from all the commandants below. Him. In the closing days of the war, Glucks attempted to flee but died, likely by suicide, in May 1945 in a naval hospital at Flensburg. He was 56 years old. Like Eicke before him and several of the most senior figures in the camp hierarchy, he died before any trial could be organized, depriving prosecutors and history of the testimony his position would have generated. The story of Hermine Braunsteiner represents one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire post-war era. A former SS guard living openly in New York City, married to an American citizen, entirely unknown to her neighbors who had no idea they were living next door to one of the most sadistic female guards the camp system had produced. Born on July 16, 1919 in Vienna, Austria, Braunsteiner had joined the SS Aufseherinnen in 1939 and received her initial training at Ravensbrück before being transferred to the Majdanek concentration and extermination camp near Lublin in occupied Poland. Majdanek was one of the Operation Reinhard camps and one of the few killing centers that was liberated by Soviet forces while the infrastructure was still largely intact, providing unusually complete physical evidence of its function. Braunsteiner served at Majdanek from 1942 to 1944, and survivor testimony described her as conducting exceptionally brutal violence, using a whip and wearing steel-tipped boots to kick prisoners, earning her the nickname Mar, the Polish word for Mar, a reference to her kicking. She was accused of selecting children for the gas chambers and personally participating in their execution. After the war, Braunsteiner was tried in Austria, convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, which she served. She was released in 1950, and in 1958 she emigrated to Canada and then to the United States, where she married an American construction worker named Russell Ryan in 1959. She became an American citizen in 1963 and settled in a quiet neighborhood in Queens, New York. For years she was simply Hermine Ryan, the wife of a local construction worker, a stocky middle-aged woman with an Austrian accent who kept a tidy house on 73rd Avenue. In 1964, Simon Wiesenthal's documentation center in Vienna identified her as the former Braunsteiner. The identification was eventually communicated to journalists, including New York Times reporter Josef Lelyveld, who knocked on her door in 1964 and confronted her directly. She admitted to having been at Majdanek but denied any participation in crimes. What followed was a decade-long legal and diplomatic battle over her extradition to West Germany. The American government was eventually persuaded to act, and in 1973, after a protracted legal process, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan became the first American citizen to be extradited to a foreign country for war crimes. She was tried in the major Dusseldorf Majdanek trial, which lasted from November 1975 to June 1981, the longest criminal trial in German legal history up to that point. Convicted of joint murder in the killing of at least 1,000 people and complicity in the murder of tens of thousands more, Braunsteiner Ryan was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1981. She was released in 1996 on health grounds and died in 1999 in Bochum, Germany. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which ran from December 1963 to August 1965, represented the most significant German-led attempt to prosecute Auschwitz personnel and had a profound effect not only on the individuals in the dock but on West German society's entire relationship to its Nazi past. The trials were initiated primarily through the efforts of Fritz Baer, the Attorney General of Hesse, the same official who had provided the tip that led to Eichmann's capture in Argentina. Baer was himself a German Jew who had survived the Nazi period in exile in Scandinavia and had returned to Germany after the war, driven by a conviction that German courts, not just Allied tribunals, needed to confront the crimes of the camp system. Assembling evidence for the Frankfurt trials required years of painstaking work by a team of investigators who travelled across Europe and beyond, collecting survivor testimony and tracking down documentary evidence. 22 former Auschwitz SS personnel were eventually put in the dock, representing a cross-section of the camp's hierarchical structure, from senior officers to ordinary guards. Among the defendants was Wilhelm Boger, who had served in the Auschwitz camp Gestapo and had developed a torture instrument known as the Boger swing, a device to which prisoners were suspended while being beaten, which had become notorious in survivor accounts. Boger was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. Robert Mulker, who had served as Rudolf Höss's adjutant, was convicted of aiding and abetting murder and sentenced to 14 years in prison, subsequently reduced to 10 years. Several defendants received life sentences, but others received what many survivors considered shockingly lenient terms, reflecting the narrow legal framework within which German courts were required to operate, which demanded proof of individual intent to kill rather than the broader command responsibility principles used at the Nuremberg proceedings. The most significant aspect of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials was not necessarily the sentences handed down, but the public reckoning they forced on West German society. The proceedings were covered extensively in the German press, and for the first time since the immediate post-war years, a younger generation of Germans was confronted with detailed, documented evidence of what had occurred at Auschwitz. The playwright Peter Weiss attended the trials and used them as the basis for his 1965 documentary drama Die Ermittlung, The Investigation, which brought the courtroom testimony to a wider European theatrical audience. The sociologist Theodor Adorno wrote extensively about the trials' implications for German self-understanding. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials helped catalyze the broader cultural reckoning with the Nazi past that would transform West German society through the late 1960s and 1970s. Johann Paul Kramer was an SS physician who served at Auschwitz from August to November 1942. A relatively brief period, but one he documented in considerable detail in a personal diary that became one of the most quoted primary sources of the Holocaust, primarily because it captured, in the private language of a man who was not performing for any audience, the casual normalization of mass murder. Kramer was born on December 26, 1883 in Steinfurt, Westphalia, and had enjoyed a distinguished academic career as a professor of anatomy at the University of Münster before the war. At Auschwitz, he participated in selections on the Birkenau ramp, presided over experimental procedures on prisoners, and watched gassings on multiple occasions. His diary entries from this period oscillate between references to the terrible scenes he has witnessed and complaints about the quality of his food or his difficulty sleeping, a juxtaposition that captures with horrible clarity the psychological normalization that allowed perpetrators to function. Kramer was captured by British forces and tried in the Krakow Auschwitz trial in Poland in 1947. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Polish President Bolesław Bierut. He was subsequently released in 1958 after serving 11 years and returned to West Germany. There, he was tried again by a West German court on the basis of the same diary evidence and was convicted in 1960, sentenced to 10 years, with the time already served in Poland credited against the sentence. He was immediately released as he had already served more than the required time. Johann Paul Kramer died in Münster in 1965 at the age of 81, having survived his crimes by nearly 2 decades. The role of camp doctors in the concentration camp system deserves particular examination, because the corruption of medicine within the camp system represents one of the most profound betrayals of a professional ethical tradition in modern history. SS physicians who served at Auschwitz and other camps were not only conducting the ramp selections, sending hundreds of thousands to immediate death, but were also the formal medical authority over the camp's prisoner population, a position that created grotesque contradictions. They were supposed to maintain prisoner health for labour purposes, while simultaneously administering a system designed to kill those deemed unfit for labour. They conducted experiments without consent on living prisoners. They administered the Zyklon B to the gas chambers or supervised its administration. Eduard Wirtz served as the garrison physician at Auschwitz from 1942 to January 1945, the most senior SS medical officer in the complex, and thus had oversight of all medical operations in the camp. Unlike some of his colleagues who clearly revelled in cruelty, Wirtz was described by some survivors as attempting to maintain some standard of medical care for the prisoner population, even while presiding over the killing apparatus. After the war, Wirtz was arrested by British forces in September 1945, and before he could be brought to trial, hanged himself in his cell. He was 40 years old. The testimony that might have illuminated the internal workings of the medical system at Auschwitz from the most senior perspective was lost with him. The story of the ordinary camp guard below the level of commandants and senior officers is in some ways the most difficult aspect of post-war justice to evaluate, because it involves understanding how thousands of ordinary individuals came to participate in a system of mass murder without ever, in many cases, personally killing anyone with their own hands. The studies of historians like Christopher Browning, whose work on Reserve Police Battalion 101 traced how ordinary middle-aged German men became mass killers through a process of gradual desensitization and peer pressure, have illuminated how the machinery of genocide recruited and retained its perpetrators. For every Mengele who seemed to seek out opportunity for sadism, there were dozens of guards who participated in the system more passively, standing watch, processing paperwork, looking away. After the war, many of these men could genuinely claim, in some limited technical sense, that they had never personally murdered anyone. German courts struggled with the legal frameworks for prosecuting them. The Sobibor camp illustrates these complexities with particular clarity. Sobibor, one of the 3 Operation Reinhard extermination camps alongside Treblinka and Belzec, murdered approximately 170,000 people between its operation beginning in May 1942 and its closure in October 1943, which came partly as a consequence of a prisoner uprising on October 14, 1943, in which about 300 prisoners escaped. The camp was subsequently dismantled and the site disguised. Because Sobibor was a pure killing centre with almost no surviving prisoner population at liberation, the number of perpetrators prosecuted was limited. However, the case of John Demjanjuk, discussed below, and the cases of several German and Ukrainian guards prosecuted in West Germany in the 1960s brought the camp's history into public consciousness. The T4 euthanasia program, which preceded the concentration camps as a killing operation, produced its own set of post-war legal proceedings and its own roster of perpetrators who largely escaped justice. The program, which murdered approximately 200,000 disabled German civilians between 1939 and 1941, using carbon monoxide gas in disguised killing facilities, provided both the technical knowledge and a number of the personnel who were later deployed in the extermination camps. Victor Brack, who had directed the T4 program's organizational structure, was tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947, convicted of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and hanged at Landsberg prison on June 2, 1948. But many of the doctors and medical professionals who had participated in the euthanasia killings faced minimal scrutiny, their crimes classified as having been conducted against German citizens under German law, rather than as war crimes against foreign nationals, a legal distinction that provided some protection in the early post-war period. The case of John Demjanjuk became one of the most legally contested and emotionally charged war crimes proceedings of the late 20th century, spanning 4 decades and 3 countries and raising profound questions about the limits of memory, the standards of evidence required in cases of such antiquity, and the obligations of justice to survivors who had waited for 40 and 50 years. Born on April 3, 1920 in Dubovi Makarinci in the Soviet Union, in what is now Ukraine, Ivan Demjanjuk was a young Red Army soldier when he was captured by German forces in 1942. He was subsequently recruited or coerced, the precise degree of volition has been debated, into service as a camp guard for the SS auxiliary guards of this type, known as Troniki men, after the training camp in occupied Poland where they were prepared, were recruited from Soviet prisoners of war, predominantly Ukrainians, and served in various capacities across the concentration and extermination camp system. Demjanjuk emigrated to the United States after the war, settling in Cleveland, Ohio, where he worked as an auto worker at the Ford plant and built a comfortable life with his family. In 1952, he became a resident alien, and in 1958, a naturalized American citizen. He lived quietly in the Cleveland suburb of Seven Hills for decades, attending the local Ukrainian Orthodox Church, raising his children. He was indistinguishable from thousands of other Ukrainian immigrants who had come to America after the displaced persons crisis of the post-war years. Then, in the mid-1970s, survivors in Israel began identifying photographs provided by American authorities, and several Israeli and Polish survivors identified a photograph of Demjanjuk as the man they knew as Ivan the Terrible, an exceptionally brutal guard at the Treblinka extermination camp who had operated the gas chamber engine. If the identification was correct, Demjanjuk had not merely been a passive guard somewhere in the camp system. He had been one of the primary killers at one of the largest death camps in Europe. The American government moved to strip Demjanjuk of his citizenship in 1981, and he was extradited to Israel in 1986, where he was tried between 1987 and 1988. He was convicted of being Ivan the Terrible and sentenced to death. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of enormous emotional intensity, with survivor testimony forming the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. However, after the conviction, new evidence emerged from Soviet archives opened after the fall of the Berlin Wall that suggested Demjanjuk might not be Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka at all. Documents recovered from Soviet archives indicated that a different man, Ivan Marchenko, had been the guard at Treblinka's gas chambers. The Israeli Supreme Court, in 1993, overturned Demjanjuk's conviction, concluding that the doubt raised by the new evidence was sufficient to require acquittal. He was freed and returned to the United States. But the story was not over. American authorities continued to investigate Demjanjuk's wartime record and accumulated evidence that even if he was not the Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, he had served as a guard at Sobibor during the period when that camp was actively murdering its victims, and at other camps including Majdanek and Flossenburg. In 2009, at the age of 89, he was extradited to Germany to stand trial in Munich. The Munich trial applied a legal theory that proved to be a landmark in the history of war crimes prosecution. The court held that simply serving as a guard at an extermination camp was sufficient to establish guilt as an accessory to murder, without the prosecution needing to prove that the defendant had committed or ordered any specific killing. In May 2011, at the age of 91, Demjanjuk was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he remained free pending appeal. He died on March 17, 2012, in a care home in Bavaria at 91 years old before the appeal process was complete, which meant under German law that the conviction was vacated. Nevertheless, the legal principle established in his case that mere participation in the machinery of an extermination camp constituted criminal accessory to murder transformed the possibilities for prosecuting the remaining elderly former guards. That legal innovation was immediately put to use. In 2015, Oskar Gröning stood trial in Lüneburg, Germany, on charges of accessory to the murder of 300,000 people. Gröning was 93 years old. He had served at Auschwitz-Birkenau from 1942 to 1944 as a guard and bookkeeper, counting and sorting the foreign currency and valuables taken from arriving deportees, and he had been present on the Birkenau ramp during selections. He had never personally gassed anyone or directly killed any prisoner. After the war, he had built a career in the glassware industry in Lower Saxony, living quietly until the 1980s when he began speaking publicly about what he had witnessed at Auschwitz, partly motivated by revulsion at Holocaust denial. He acknowledged what he had seen and done, stated clearly that the Holocaust had occurred, and expressed that he bore moral responsibility for what he had witnessed and participated in through his work. He described himself publicly as morally guilty, but doubted he was criminally culpable, a position the German court emphatically rejected. Gröning's trial attracted enormous media attention, partly because of his age, partly because he had voluntarily provided extensive testimony about Auschwitz to historians and journalists over the years, and partly because the case raised in vivid form the question that has haunted the post-war legal reckoning. What does justice require of the very old, the very minor, the cogs in a wheel of murder who never personally pulled a trigger? Gröning was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He never served the sentence. Repeated medical evaluations delayed his incarceration, and he died on March 9, 2018, before being imprisoned. He was 96 years old. The bookkeeper of Auschwitz died in his bed. The pursuit of former camp guards continued into the 2000s and beyond. In 2016, Reinhold Hanning, 94 years old, was convicted by a German court of accessory to the murder of 170,000 people at Auschwitz, where he had served as a guard from 1943 to 1944. He was sentenced to 5 years, and like Gröning, he died in 2017 before the sentence was served. In 2020, a 93-year-old German man who had served as a guard at the Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig was put on trial in Hamburg, charged with accessory to the murder of over 5,000 people. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years suspended. These cases, coming 75 and 80 years after the crimes were committed, produced sentences that could never be served, but their proponents argued that even a nominal conviction carried moral and historical significance, a formal acknowledgement by German courts that what had occurred was murder, and that those who had participated, however peripherally, bore some legal responsibility. The question of the Trauerkey Guards, the non-German auxiliaries drawn from the occupied Soviet territories, who served alongside SS personnel at the extermination camps, presents particular complexity in the post-war legal record. Tens of thousands of men from Ukraine, the Baltic states, Russia, and elsewhere in the Soviet Union served in various capacities in the camp system. Many had been prisoners of war who faced a choice between starvation and service. Many others volunteered. After the war, those who ended up in the Soviet Union faced summary justice or the labor camp system. Those who made it to the West, like Demjanjuk, often successfully disguised their wartime service for decades. The Soviet Union, itself a country with a history of mass atrocities, had limited moral authority to press for their prosecution, and Western governments were for years reluctant to examine too closely the records of immigrants from the Soviet bloc who presented themselves as fleeing communist persecution. The Office of Special Investigations, established within the United States Department of Justice in 1979, undertook the systematic investigation of Nazi war criminals who had immigrated to the United States and was responsible for the cases against Demjanjuk, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan, and numerous others over its 4 decades of operation. By the time the OSY was merged into a broader human rights office in 2010, it had investigated approximately 1,500 individuals and successfully prosecuted more than 100 cases. Germany's Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, established in Ludwigsburg in 1958, served a similar coordinating function for German prosecutors. The establishment of these dedicated investigative bodies reflected a recognition that the initial post-war proceedings, for all their scale and ambition, had left a significant portion of the camp system's perpetrators unaccounted for. Ephraim Zuroff, the chief Nazi hunter at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, has dedicated his career since the 1970s to identifying, locating, and building cases against former perpetrators. By the late 2010s, Zuroff and his colleagues were increasingly frustrated, not by the absence of leads, but by the reluctance of European governments to proceed against individuals who were by then in their 90s, frail, and in many cases suffering from dementia. The argument was repeatedly made by defense attorneys, by family members of the accused, and by some judges that prosecuting a 95-year-old man for crimes committed when he was 22 served no meaningful purpose. The survivors and their families argued with equal conviction that justice had no statute of limitations and that the age of the accused was a product of decades of governmental and prosecutorial failure that should not benefit the perpetrators further. The case of Alois Brunner, perhaps the most senior Nazi war crimes suspect still living into the 21st century, illustrated how some perpetrators successfully evaded all accountability for their entire lives. Born on April 8, 1912, in Nadas in Austria-Hungary, Brunner was Adolf Eichmann's personal assistant and one of the most directly effective organizers of Jewish deportations in the entire Third Reich. He directed the deportations from Vienna in 1938, from Salonika in Greece in 1943, from France in 1943 and 1944, and from Slovakia in 1944 and 1945. He was personally responsible for organizing the deportation of an estimated 130,000 Jews to the extermination camps. After the war, he fled to Syria, where he lived in Damascus for decades under Syrian government protection, reportedly working for Syrian intelligence. Multiple attempts to assassinate him using letter bombs, organized by Israeli intelligence, badly injured him in 1961 and 1980, but did not kill him. Germany and France both issued extradition requests that Syria ignored. He reportedly died in Syria sometime in the late 1990s or early 2000s, though the precise date of his death was never officially confirmed. He was never tried for anything. The ratlines that carried Brunner, Mengele, Eichmann, Stangl, and hundreds of others out of post-war Europe were not a single organized network, but rather a loose and overlapping series of escape routes facilitated by different combinations of people and institutions. The term Ratline, a naval term for the rope ladders on a ship's rigging, was applied to these routes by American intelligence operatives who were monitoring them in the late 1940s. Two principal routes emerged. The first ran from Germany through Austria to Italy, where the International Red Cross was issuing travel documents on humanitarian grounds to individuals who claimed to have lost their identity papers in the chaos of the war's end. A number of Catholic clergy in Rome, most controversially including Bishop Alois Hudal, who was the rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, provided assistance to fugitive Nazis out of a combination of anti-communism, Germanic sympathy, and in some cases simple failure to understand the scale of what they were helping to hide. From Italy, fugitives could sail to Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or other South American countries whose governments, particularly Juan Perón's Argentina, were prepared to accept European immigrants without asking too many questions. The second rat line ran through Spain, whose Francoist government maintained friendly relations with the Nazi regime throughout the war, and provided a haven for fugitives in the post-war period. Several hundred former SS personnel and Nazi officials settled in Spain during the 1950s and 1960s, living in Spanish resort towns on the Mediterranean coast or in quiet Madrid neighborhoods. Odessa, whose full name in German meant Organization of Former SS Members, was described by some investigators and journalists as a centrally organized escape network, though subsequent historical research has suggested that it was rather less cohesive and organized than its reputation implied. More of a loose association of helpers and money sources than a bureaucratically structured organization. Simon Wiesenthal's memoirs described Odessa as a significant force in post-war Nazi escape, and his account was dramatized in Frederick Forsyth's 1972 thriller, The Odessa File, which brought the concept of Nazi escape networks to millions of readers worldwide. Argentina, under Juan Perón, was the most significant single destination for high-ranking Nazi fugitives. Perón had welcomed German immigration since the early 1940s and maintained agents in Europe after the war who facilitated the entry of former SS and Nazi officials. The precise number of war criminals who settled in Argentina is disputed, with estimates ranging from several hundred to several thousand, but the country's failure to extradite any significant Nazi fugitive until the Eichmann capture in 1960 demonstrated how thoroughly the Argentine government had extended its protection. In addition to Eichmann, Mengele, and Stangl, Argentina also sheltered figures like Erich Priebke, who had participated in the Ardeatine cave massacre in Italy in 1944, the killing of 335 civilians, for which Field Marshal Kesselring was also held partly responsible. Priebke lived in Bariloche, a Patagonian resort town with a large German community, for decades until he was identified in a 1994 ABC News interview. He was extradited to Italy in 1995, tried, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment, which he served under house arrest due to his advanced age. He died under house arrest in Rome in 2013 at the age of 100. The operation of the post-war rat lines was not purely a story of private charity and ideological sympathy. American and British intelligence services were also, at various points, recruiting and protecting former SS and Gestapo personnel who were perceived as valuable assets in the emerging Cold War. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon in occupied France, known as the Butcher of Lyon, for his role in the torture and execution of French resistance members and the deportation of Jews, was recruited by American counterintelligence corps agents after the war, who valued his knowledge of communist networks. The Americans sheltered Barbie in West Germany until 1951, when his past was becoming a liability, and then helped him escape to Bolivia using a rat line. He lived in Bolivia as Klaus Altmann for decades, building a business career and consulting for Bolivian intelligence services. He was identified in 1971 by Nazi hunters Sergei and Beta Klasfeld, but Bolivia refused to extradite him. In 1983, a new civilian government in Bolivia expelled him, and he was flown to France, where he was tried and convicted of crimes against humanity in 1987. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in Lyons Prison in 1991 at the age of 77. The Klasfeld connection is worth dwelling on because it represents a particular kind of relentless private pursuit that complemented and often pushed the slower machinery of official justice. Beate and Serge Klasfeld, a French-German couple who met in Paris in the 1960s, devoted their lives to identifying and pursuing former Nazi criminals. Serge's father had been deported from France to Auschwitz and murdered. The Klarsfelds used a combination of investigative journalism, political pressure, and deliberate public confrontation to force both German and French governments to take action against individuals who might otherwise have continued to live undisturbed. Beate Klarsfeld famously slapped West German Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger in public in 1968, calling him a Nazi, to draw attention to his wartime party membership. It was the Klarsfelds who identified and publicly named Kurt Lischke, a former Gestapo official responsible for the deportation of French Jews who was living openly in Cologne in the 1960s. They found Barbie in Bolivia. They identified other fugitives in Latin America, Brazil, and across Europe. Their organization, the Sons and Daughters of Jewish Deportees from France, continued operating into the 21st century. The network of those who pursued justice for camp crimes also included the extraordinary figure of Simon Wiesenthal himself, born on December 31, 1908, in Bucach in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now Ukraine. Wiesenthal had survived multiple concentration camps, including Mauthausen, by a combination of luck and the occasional mercy of individual guards who helped him. He had lost close to 90 members of his own family in the Holocaust. After liberation, he made a deliberate decision not to emigrate to America or Palestine, as many survivors did, but to remain in Europe and devote himself to documenting Nazi crimes and assisting Allied investigators. He operated a Jewish documentation center in Linz and later moved his operation to Vienna, from where he pursued hundreds of cases over the following 5 decades. He was involved in identifying leads that contributed to the capture of Eichmann, the prosecution of Franz Stangl, and dozens of other successful cases. He received threats regularly throughout his life, and his Vienna office was bombed on one occasion. He continued working until his late 80s, dying on September 20, 2005, at the age of 96. He had outlived most of his enemies, though never all of them. The Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria operated from 1938 to 1945, and was the site of approximately 96,000 prisoner deaths. Its commandant for much of the war was Max Kogel, born on October 16, 1895, in Füssen in Bavaria. Kogel had served as a guard at Dachau and risen through the system to command several camps, including Ravensbrück and then Flossenbürg. After the liberation, Kogel was captured by American forces in 1945. In June 1946, while in custody awaiting trial, he committed suicide. He was 50 years old. Among the notable victims of Flossenbürg in the final days of the war was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Lutheran pastor and theologian who had been imprisoned for his participation in the German resistance and was hanged at Flossenbürg on April 9, 1945, just 3 weeks before the camp's liberation. The Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg was another major facility that produced its own complex legal aftermath. Its commandant, Max Pauli, was tried by a British military court at the Curio House trial in Hamburg in 1946 and convicted of war crimes including the execution of 20 Jewish children who had been used in medical experiments. He was hanged on October 8, 1946, but a significant number of Neuengamme personnel successfully evaded prosecution, and the British decision to convert the camp itself into a West German prison after the war, which continued operating until 2006, was widely criticised by survivor organisations as an erasure of the site's historical identity. Among the most legally significant proceedings related to the camp system in the post-war period was the Pohl trial at Nuremberg, which was formally the case number 4 of the Nuremberg subsequent proceedings conducted by American military tribunals. The trial, running from 1947 to 1948, targeted the senior leadership of the WWA, the administrative body that had run the economic dimension of the concentration camp system. Alongside Oswald Pohl, the defendants included August Frank, the deputy director of the WVHA administration department, Hans Lerner, the head of the WVHA's budget office, and numerous other senior functionaries of the camp's economic management. The prosecution's case established in detailed documentary form how the WVHA had organised forced labour, processed the stolen property of murdered victims including gold from teeth, hair shorn from bodies and personal valuables, and directed camp operations from an administrative perspective. Of the 18 defendants, 4 were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, and the remainder received sentences of varying length. The convictions established an important legal precedent that administrative management of a murder system carried criminal responsibility equivalent to direct participation. The story of Stutthof concentration camp and its post-war legal history illustrates how late in the 20th century significant prosecutions were still possible. Stutthof, located near Danzig on the Baltic coast, was the first camp established on Polish soil and one of the last to be liberated, with Soviet forces reaching it in May 1945. It had been used throughout the war for the murder of Jews, Polish civilians, Soviet POWs, and others, with over 65,000 deaths recorded. Its commandant, Johann Pauli, was tried by a Polish court and hanged in 1946. But numerous lower-ranking guards and administrators were not prosecuted for decades. In 2016, a 94-year-old former guard named Reinhold Hanning was tried and convicted at Detmold, as mentioned earlier. In 2020, a 93-year-old former guard was tried in Hamburg. And in 2021, a 100-year-old German man who had served as a guard at Stutthof was indicted. The Hamburg Regional Court found him guilty in 2022, making him, at 100, possibly the oldest person ever convicted of Nazi war crimes. The case of Hertha Bothe reflects how the female guards of the camp system occupied a peculiar position in both the post-war trials and in subsequent historical memory. Born on January 8, 1921, in Tetero in Mecklenburg, Bothe had joined the SS as an Aufseherin in 1942 and served at multiple camps including Stutthof and Bergen-Belsen. She was present at Bergen-Belsen when British forces arrived in April 1945 and was immediately arrested. Survivor witnesses described her as conducting savage beatings, earning her the nickname the Sadist of Stutthof. She was tried at the Belsen trial and convicted of war crimes. However, her sentence was relatively lenient compared to figures like Griese or Binz, 10 years imprisonment. She was released in 1951, returned to West Germany, married, and lived until 2000, dying at the age of 79. The disparity between her fate and that of Griese, who was hanged at 22, reflected the differing evidentiary standards applied to different defendants at the Belsen trial, rather than any systematic comparison of their crimes. The story of Bruno Schlager offers a window into the experience of the ordinary camp guard, who managed to live an entirely untroubled post-war existence. Schlager served as an SS guard at Auschwitz during the period of the Hungarian deportations in 1944 and was stationed at the Birkenau ramp during multiple selection procedures. After the war, he returned to West Germany, resumed civilian life, worked as a mechanic, married, and raised a family. His name was not on any Allied wanted list. He was not identified in any survivor testimonies that reached West German prosecutors. He lived in the same town he had grown up in. He went to church on Sundays. He died in 1987 at the age of 71 without ever being charged with anything. His story is not exceptional. There were thousands of Bruno Schlagers, ordinary men who passed through the camp system, witnessed or participated in murder as part of a daily routine, and then returned to ordinary life when the system collapsed, carrying their knowledge and their complicity with them into decades of peaceful retirement. The question of what percentage of camp personnel actually faced justice for their actions is difficult to calculate precisely and depends heavily on how you define accountability. But the rough historical consensus is sobering. Of the tens of thousands of SS personnel who served in concentration camps throughout the war, only a small fraction, perhaps 1 or 2%, were ever convicted of crimes specifically relating to their camp service. The vast majority either died during the war, committed suicide in 1945, lived out their lives in West Germany without prosecution, or fled to countries from which extradition was never obtained. The Nuremberg trials and the subsequent proceedings focused primarily on the senior leadership of the system. The British, American, and other Allied military tribunals focused on specific camps liberated by those forces and the personnel found at those locations. German courts, under the legal and political constraints of the 1950s and early 1960s, initially prosecuted relatively few individuals. The transformation came with the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and the establishment of the Ludwigsburg office, but even then, the personnel of hundreds of smaller camps and subcamps were never systematically investigated. The Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar in central Germany was one of the largest camps on German soil and occupies a particularly significant place in the post-war memory, because its liberation on April 11, 1945 by the American Third Army under General George Patton was accompanied by a deliberate effort to document and publicize the horrors found inside. American General Dwight Eisenhower visited Buchenwald within days of its liberation and ordered that as many American soldiers, journalists, and congressional representatives as possible be brought to see the camp for themselves, specifically to prevent the possibility that the evidence of what had occurred would be denied in later years. Local German civilians were forced to march through the camp and confront what had been happening in their vicinity. The iconic photographs and newsreel footage of Buchenwald's liberation, including the images of stacked emaciated corpses and the hollow-eyed survivors, created a visual record that shaped the world's initial understanding of the camp system. The commandant of Buchenwald during the war's final years was Hermann Pister, who had taken over from Karl Otto Koch after Koch's arrest by the SS in 1941. Pister was born on February 21, 1885 in Lübeck and had been in the SS since 1932. He managed Buchenwald during the period when it received the death marches from camps further east, when thousands of prisoners arrived at Buchenwald in catastrophic condition, and many died before or immediately after arrival. Pister was tried at the Dachau military tribunals in 1947 and convicted of war crimes. He was sentenced to death, but before the sentence could be carried out, he died of a heart attack in his cell in Landsberg prison on September 28, 1948. The satellite camp network of the major concentration camps created its own vast infrastructure of perpetrators, who largely escaped the post-war reckoning. By the end of the war, the main concentration camps had collectively spawned hundreds of subcamps, satellite facilities where prisoner labour was deployed for German industry, construction and agriculture. These subcamps were staffed by smaller SS Guard detachments, often under young and relatively junior officers who exercised substantial power over the prisoners in their custody. The conditions in the subcamps varied considerably, with some relatively functional from a prisoner survival perspective, and others marked by mortality rates comparable to the worst main camps. The guards in these facilities rarely appeared in any post-war prosecution. Their crimes, if they committed them, are almost entirely unrecorded in the legal history. The specific case of the Mittelbau-Dora camp complex illustrates the subcamp problem in concentrated form. Mittelbau-Dora, located near Nordhausen in Thuringia, was established in 1943 to provide forced labour for the underground construction and operation of the Phi 2 rocket production facility, known as the Mittelwerk. Over the course of the next 2 years, approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Dora and its subcamps, and approximately 20,000 died. Roughly a third of them during the initial construction phase, when prisoners worked in catastrophic underground conditions without adequate food, rest, or protection. The V-2 rockets produced using this murdered labour force were fired at London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. When American forces liberated Nordhausen on April 11, 1945, they found thousands of bodies, many from a bombing raid that had killed survivors of the Death March out of Dora. The American scientists and military personnel who subsequently recruited former rocket program officials, including Wernher von Braun, for Operation Paperclip chose to look past the evidence of the labour conditions at Dora, a decision that has been a source of historical controversy ever since. Wernher von Braun himself was aware of the conditions at Dora, having visited the underground facility multiple times and was never prosecuted for any role in the forced labour system that built his rockets. He went on to direct America's civilian space program and died celebrated as the father of the American moon landing in 1977. The story of Georg Conrad Morgan is one of the most genuinely paradoxical in the entire history of the camp system. Morgan was an SS judge, a Richter within the SS legal apparatus, who was assigned in 1943 to investigate corruption and unauthorized killings within the concentration camp system. In that role, he investigated and prosecuted Karl Otto Koch at Buchenwald, investigated Rudolf Höss, and examined the operations at multiple camps. His work brought him into direct knowledge of the systematic murder being carried out. At Nuremberg, he testified about what he had seen and investigated, and his testimony provided valuable documentation of the camp system's internal workings. Yet Morgan's position was deeply contradictory. He was enforcing SS disciplinary rules in facilities where millions were being murdered under official orders. The murders he investigated and prosecuted were those conducted outside the authorized killing program, not those inside it. He was never charged with complicity in the larger crime. He returned to private legal practice in West Germany after the war, became a successful lawyer in Frankfurt, and died in 1982. The SS judge who investigated crimes within the death camps never faced a criminal charge himself. The Nuremberg doctors' trial, formerly the medical case tried before the American Military Tribunal between December 1946 and August 1947, addressed the specific crimes of physicians who had participated in the medical experimentation program and the euthanasia killings. 23 defendants were tried, including the chief physician of the SS, Karl Brandt, and 16 other physicians. 7 were sentenced to death and executed on June 2, 1948. The doctors' trial produced the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles for medical research that, for the first time, formally established informed consent as a foundation of ethical human experimentation, a direct response to the experiments conducted in the camps. The code has been incorporated into international medical ethics standards and continues to govern the conduct of medical research globally. In a grim irony, the systematic violation of every principle of medical ethics by the SS physicians created the framework by which those principles were formally articulated for the benefit of future generations. Karl Klauberg was one of the SS physicians whose post-war fate combined conviction, imprisonment, release, and a second arrest in a sequence that illustrates the messy realities of the post-war legal landscape across different jurisdictions. Born on September 28, 1898, in Wupperhof, Klauberg was a gynecologist who had made a legitimate academic career before the war in the study of female infertility. At Auschwitz from 1943 to 1944, he conducted mass experiments on Jewish women injecting caustic substances into the uterus to cause sterilization as part of a broader SS program to develop efficient methods of mass sterilization for use on populations the regime considered racially undesirable. His experiments caused tremendous suffering and death. After the war, Klauberg was captured by Soviet forces and tried in the Soviet Union, convicted and sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp. He was released in 1955 as part of the general repatriation of German prisoners from the Soviet Union and returned to West Germany, where he publicly advertised his medical credentials and boasted about his work at Auschwitz, apparently not grasping that the post-war West German legal environment had changed enough to make this dangerous. The brazenness of his self-promotion sparked outrage, and legal proceedings were initiated by West German authorities. Before they could be concluded, Klauberg died in custody on August 9, 1957. He was 58 years old. Friedrich Entress was an SS physician at Auschwitz and then at the Mauthausen and Gross-Rosen camps, who participated extensively in selection procedures and lethal injections, and was convicted at the American Mauthausen trial in 1946 and executed on May 28, 1947. Josef Klair, an SS non-commissioned officer at Auschwitz who administered phenol injections directly into the hearts of prisoners in the camp hospital as a means of killing those deemed too weak for labor, was tried at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960s and convicted of murder in the cases of over 400 proven victims, receiving a life sentence. He died in 1988. The contrast between the 1946 execution of Entress and the long decades between Klair's crimes and his trial and death in prison illustrates the enormous variation in the speed of justice depending entirely on when, where, and how a perpetrator was caught. The village of Dachau in Bavaria became, after the war, a site of complex and sometimes contentious memory politics. The town had existed for centuries before the Nazis selected a nearby empty factory site for the first concentration camp, and many residents of Dachau spent decades trying to distance their community's identity from the camp that shared its name. The camp itself became a memorial site maintained by the Bavarian state government, and from the 1960s onward, it received millions of visitors, including school groups, politicians, and survivors. Yet the process by which local communities throughout Germany confronted the proximity of camps that had operated in their midst, camps whose existence had been known to local populations, even if not always understood in their full horror, was slow, contested, and incomplete. Historian Robert Gellatley's research into the visibility of the camp system to ordinary Germans established that knowledge of the camps was widespread, even if knowledge of their full lethal function was more variable. How many camp guards, when you count all the camps and all their personnel, were ever brought to any kind of legal accountability for their service? The most comprehensive estimates suggest that no more than 10% of those who served as SS guards in the camp system ever faced any legal proceeding at all, and of those, a significant proportion received sentences that bore no proportional relationship to the scale of suffering they had participated in or facilitated. 30 years in prison, or even a death sentence, for an individual whose service had encompassed the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, represents a profound inadequacy of conventional criminal justice when applied to crimes of mass atrocity. The legal systems of the post-war period were not designed for crimes of this scale. They had no precedent for them. The Nuremberg trials created new law in order to address crimes for which no law yet existed. And the ongoing evolution of that law through the subsequent decades, through the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and ultimately the Permanent International Criminal Court, reflects the continuing effort of the international community to develop legal frameworks adequate to the reality that the 20th century revealed about human capacity for organized mass killing. The camp of Theresienstadt in Bohemia, known in Czech as Terezin, occupied a unique position in the concentration camp system and produced its own distinctive cast of post-war legal history. Theresienstadt was presented by the Nazi propaganda apparatus as a model ghetto, a show camp to which the regime sent prominent Jewish artists, musicians, academics and intellectuals, and which it periodically opened to international Red Cross inspection to counter growing international awareness of the extermination program. In reality, Theresienstadt functioned primarily as a transit camp through which the majority of its inhabitants passed on their way to Auschwitz and other extermination centres. Of the approximately 144,000 Jews who passed through Theresienstadt, over 90,000 were deported to the extermination camps and killed. An additional 33,000 died in the camp itself of the appalling overcrowding, starvation and disease conditions. The commandants and senior SS staff of Theresienstadt faced various post-war fates. Siegfried Seidel, who commanded the camp from its establishment in 1941 until 1943, was tried in Austria after the war and hanged in Vienna on February 4, 1947. Anton Burger, who succeeded Seidel and commanded Theresienstadt from July 1943 to February 1944, also served at other camps and was sentenced to death by an Austrian court in absentia. He managed to escape from American custody in 1947, however, and spent the rest of his life under assumed identities in West Germany, dying in Essen in 1991 without ever serving his sentence. Karl Rahm, the final commandant of Theresienstadt, was captured and tried by a Czechoslovak court. He was convicted of war crimes and executed in April 1947 in Litoměřice. The history of the Chelmno extermination camp, the first of the pure killing centres established by the Nazis, represents one of the most complete erasures both of a facility and of accountability for those who operated it. Chelmno, established in December 1941 in the Warthegau region of occupied Poland, used mobile gas vans rather than fixed gas chambers and murdered between 150,000 and 350,000 people, primarily Jews from the Łódź ghetto and surrounding areas. When the camp was finally abandoned by the Germans, they attempted to demolish all evidence of its existence. So successful were they that after the war, many people were initially unsure the camp had even existed. The tiny number of survivors who had escaped or been retained as forced labourers to dispose of bodies were the primary evidence of what had occurred. The SS personnel who operated the camp largely dispersed into the general population. Hans Bothmann, the second commandant of Chelmno, committed suicide in 1946 after his arrest. Walter Burmeister, a guard who operated the gas vans, was tried by a West German court in 1962 and convicted of murder, sentenced to life imprisonment. But most Chelmno personnel faced no prosecution. The history of the Belzec extermination camp is even more remarkable in terms of the near-total absence of post-war accountability. Belzec, which operated from March 1942 to December 1942 in the Lublin district of occupied Poland, murdered between 430,000 and 500,000 people, almost all of them Jews from the Lublin and Lviv districts, making it the third largest death toll of any single facility in the Holocaust. It was operated by a small permanent SS staff of about 20 Germans and perhaps 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, Belzec left virtually no surviving witnesses among its victims, as only 7 Jews were known to have survived from among those deported there. The SS staff were transferred to other assignments when the camp was closed and demolished. After the war, the central perpetrators at Belzec faced almost no accountability whatsoever. Christian Wirth, who had established and initially commanded Belzec and was the overall inspector of all 3 Operation Reinhard camps, was killed by Yugoslav partisans in May 1944, dying before any post-war reckoning could occur. Gottlieb Hering, who commanded Belzec during its operational period, died in 1945. Josef Oberhauser, the only member of the Belzec camp staff to face any prosecution in West Germany, was tried in Munich in 1965 and convicted of aiding and abetting the murder of 300,000 people. He received a sentence of 4.5 years imprisonment, which he had largely already served in. Pre-trial detention. He was released immediately and died in 1979. The legacy of the camp system on German national consciousness is impossible to summarize in any simple way, because the Federal Republic of Germany's engagement with that legacy has been one of the most extensively studied and debated aspects of post-war European history. The concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, meaning coming to terms with the past, has been central to West German political culture since at least the 1960s. When the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and the student revolts of 1968 forced a confrontation with the Nazi period that the Adenauer generation had largely tried to avoid, West Germany paid substantial reparations to Israel and to individual Holocaust survivors through agreements concluded in the 1950s and 1960s. German textbooks from the 1970s onward devoted increasing attention to the Nazi period and the Holocaust. The German law that makes Holocaust denial a criminal offence under Section 130 of the Criminal Code reflects the judgment that the legal system itself needs to be deployed against those who would erase or distort the historical record. Yet the very thoroughness of the Federal Republic's public engagement with the Nazi past has sometimes obscured the extent to which, at the individual level, accountability remained partial and incomplete. A country can build excellent Holocaust memorials, teach rigorous history, pay reparations, and still allow the majority of those who operated the killing centres to live out their lives undisturbed. Germany did all of these things simultaneously. The historians, journalists, and survivor organisations who pushed for more prosecutions through the late 20th century were not challenging Germany's collective memory project. They were pointing to its limits, arguing that honouring the dead required also holding the living responsible wherever possible. One of the most significant shifts in German memory culture in recent decades was the 2005 opening of the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in the heart of Berlin, a vast installation of concrete stelae between the Brandenburg Gate and the site of Hitler's bunker. The memorial was the product of decades of controversy and debate about how to remember the Holocaust in the centre of the capital that had administered it. Peter Eisenman's design, with its disorienting grid of grey rectangular blocks of varying heights that visitors can walk through, was deliberately intended to create an unsettling, disorienting experience, rather than a conventional commemorative monument. The memorial stands as a permanent statement about what Germany owes to history, but it is also a reminder that no amount of stone and concrete can substitute for justice actually served on the individuals who operated the machinery of murder. In the early 2020s, German prosecutors were still working their way through the final cases against the last living individuals with documentable connections to the concentration camp system. Most of these defendants were in their 90s or older, and nearly all cases ended with the defendant's death before or shortly after conviction. In 2022, a woman in her 90s who had served as a secretary at the Stutthof camp headquarters was tried for accessory to murder. She had been 17 at the time. The question of whether a teenage secretary who had typed correspondence for camp administrators bore criminal responsibility for the murders that correspondence helped to organize was debated extensively in German legal and public discourse. The court found her guilty. The verdict was appealed. The final resolution of the case was pending at the time of this video. What is certain is that this case will be among the very last of its kind, not because the crimes it addressed were the least significant, but because the passage of 80 years since the liberation of the camps has finally, irreversibly, exhausted the living perpetrators. The last concentration camp guard from the Second World War is almost certainly already gone, or close to it. What, in the end, are we to make of the story of the camp guards after World War II? The picture that emerges from the evidence is a deeply uneven one. justice was served dramatically and emphatically in some cases. Höss hanged beside his own crematorium. Eichmann executed after a trial that brought the full reality of the Holocaust before an international audience. Amon Göth swinging at Krakow prison. The Belsen personnel dispatched at Hamelin in December 1945. Justice moved agonizingly slowly in other cases, catching men in their 80s and 90s in German courtrooms for crimes committed in their youth. And justice failed entirely in countless other cases, as guards, supervisors and administrators retired peacefully to West German towns, as fugitives disappeared into South American anonymity, as witnesses died before investigators could reach them, as the passage of time eroded evidence and blurred memory. There is a phrase used by those who think carefully about mass atrocity and accountability. Justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, but justice denied for long enough eventually becomes something very close to it. The story of the camp guards after World War II is a story of that tension, played out in real human lives and real legal proceedings across 8 decades. The work of those who pursued the perpetrators, from the Allied tribunals of 1945 and 1946 through the Mossad team that grabbed Eichmann from a Buenos Aires street in 1960, through the German prosecutors who built the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, through Wiesenthal and the Klarsfelds and Ephraim Zuroff and all the others who refused to let time become a final verdict of acquittal, represents one of the more admirable sustained endeavours in the history of law and human rights. It was never enough. It could never be enough. But it was also never nothing. And the hundreds of convictions obtained over 8 decades, however imperfect, constituted a refusal to allow the architects and operators of the greatest deliberate mass murder in recorded history to walk away entirely free. For the survivors who waited decades to see a former camp guard stand in a German courtroom, even a conviction that came when the defendant was 90 years old and could never serve the sentence meant something. It was the recognition of law that their suffering had been real, that the person who had facilitated it bore responsibility, that the state acknowledged the crime. Whether that acknowledgement can ever be commensurate with the crime is another question entirely, one that belongs not to the courtroom but to the more unresolvable realms of moral philosophy and human grief. The numbers we deal with when discussing the Holocaust are so large that they resist comprehension. 6 million Jews, 11 million total victims of the camp system, including Soviet POWs, Polish civilians, Roma, homosexuals and others. 6 million is a number that the human mind cannot hold in its full reality. But Rudolf Höss held it in his, organised it, improved its efficiency, and stood at the end on a gallows beside his own crematorium. And for all its inadequacy, for all the thousands who escaped, and the thousands who were never charged, that image of Höss on the gallows at Auschwitz-Birkenau, executed at the very site of his crimes, matters. It is the thing that separates the historical record of the Holocaust from the record of those atrocities where nothing was ever answered for at all. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. The story of what happened to the camp guards after World War II is one of the most important and sobering chapters in the entire history of post-war justice, raising questions about accountability, the limits of legal systems, and the responsibilities of nations toward the truth of their pasts that remain as urgent today as they were in the ruins of 1945. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about Where Did the Waffen-SS Go After 1945, which covers in fascinating detail what happened to Hitler's elite soldiers once the Third Reich collapsed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. Let's consider one more figure whose story encapsulates many of the themes we have explored throughout this video. Heinrich Himmler himself, the architect and absolute commander of the entire SS empire, the man who had signed the orders, built the institution and personally oversaw the murder of millions. Born on October 7, 1900, in Munich, Bavaria, Himmler grew up as the son of a schoolteacher, was raised Catholic, and nursed dreams of a military career that World War I ended before he could properly begin it. He, joined the Nazi Party in 1923, participated in the failed beer hall putsch of that year, and by 1929 had been placed in command of the SS, then a small bodyguard unit of just 290 men. What Himmler built from that tiny organisation over the following 16 years was the most lethal bureaucratic empire in modern history. The concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen, the Waffen-SS, the SD, the Gestapo, the deportation machinery that ran the death trains to the east. When historians calculate responsibility for the Holocaust, Himmler's name stands directly below Hitler's. In the final weeks of the war, Himmler began secret negotiations with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden in an attempt to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, imagining that he might position himself as a post-Hitler statesman in a rump German state. When Hitler learned of these negotiations, he flew into his final documented rage and stripped Himmler of all his offices. After the German surrender on May 8, 1945, Himmler attempted to flee in disguise. He shaved his distinctive moustache, wore a private soldier's uniform, and travelled with false papers. On May 21, 1945, he was stopped at a British checkpoint at Bremerwörde. He was arrested and transferred to British Second Army headquarters at Lüneburg for interrogation. On May 23, 1945, as British intelligence officers were preparing to examine him, Himmler bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule concealed in a false tooth and died within minutes. He was 44 years old. The man who had ordered the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others died before a single charge could be read against him in a British interrogation room in northern Germany. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a forest near Lüneburg, the location of which was kept secret to prevent any shrine forming. The master of the camp system was denied even the scaffold. Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, which coordinated the Gestapo, the SD, and the operational administration of the final solution, had died even earlier on June 4, 1942, 9 days after being mortally wounded in Prague by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained in Britain and dropped by the SOE in Operation Anthropoid. Heydrich had been appointed acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941 and had combined effective pacification of Czech resistance with the efficient deportation of Czech Jews. The assassination of Heydrich was one of the most significant acts of resistance against the Nazi regime during the entire war, and the German reprisals, including the total destruction of the village of Lidis and the murder of its male population, reflected the terror that even the death of a single senior SS leader could provoke. Heydrich, like Eicke and Himmler, died without ever facing a courtroom. The three men most architecturally responsible for the concentration camp system all escaped human justice, dying by enemy action, by their own hands, or in Eicke's case, in battle. It was left to the courts to address those below them, and the story of that effort, in all its incompleteness, is the story we have told today.